Hello, I hope you've been having a good festive season and New Year. I've just been at home this entire time, just with my partner, and it's been really lovely. I've just been watching a lot of movies and eating way too much, but also doing a bit of reading as well. So I thought I'd go through the books that I read in December and talk about them. But first, just in the new year, the first couple of days of the new year, I want to mention that my partner and I have done this really fun thing. I've talked in the past about what a big fan of the Golden Girls I am, and my partner got me for Christmas this festive Golden Girls sweatshirt, which is really lovely. And so the past couple of days we've been having a Golden Girls marathon, and that has been absolutely wonderful. I think we've watched about a dozen episodes or so. I have to stop myself from just rewatching the whole thing because it is so rewatchable. But yeah, that's been really fun. So to start off, in the very beginning of December, I read Dear Reader by Cathy Rentzenbrink, and I made a whole video about what a fan I was of this book. So I won't go into it too much, though. I've been wanting to get this book for ages. I think it came out in September of last year, and I'd wanted to read it as soon as I got an advance copy of it. But because I was reading books for the Costa Book Awards, I just didn't have time to get to it, and I was also trying to read books for the Booker Prize as well, and so I kept putting it off and putting it off. So when it got to December, I was like, right, I'm reading this book, and I am so glad I did, because listening to the story of Cathy Rentzenbrink's reading life, and all of the books that have really inspired her, reading all of her summaries of them, but also her experience developing as a reader, how she's just always naturally been a reader, but the way she's connected with other people through reading over the years by with her family, but also by becoming a bookseller, and then working with people in prisons to try to help increase literacy, was so wonderful. And it is such an inspiring book in that way, and how the way that books really bring us together, but also because it's like a list of books that have really inspired her. It's given me another list of books that hopefully I'll get to at some point. And then there's the pleasure of talking about a book that I've read and also loved. There's that wonderful sense of recognition and being like, oh yeah, that's a book that I really loved as well. So yeah, this was such a wonderful reading experience, and it really does get to what it says in the title or the subtitle of it, of the comfort and joy of books, because I think it captures that so well. Then there is a debut novel by Zalika Reid-Benta called Plantain, and this came out several months ago as well, and is another book that I really wanted to get to. And I wasn't sure going into it whether it was actually a novel or short stories. I think I went into it thinking it was just short stories, but they're sort of interlinked short stories that follow like a narrative progression. Basically, it's about a adolescent and teenage girl who is Canadian of Jamaican heritage, and it follows her throughout her teenage years, up until when she becomes a young woman. And so you're following the story of her life, but each chapter does basically work like a short story, because it's these kind of self-contained moments or events in her life, and I just loved it. I loved the way the progression of it, and the way you got such a sense of her character through her relationships with her family and her friends, which quite often are very antagonistic, and she had quite problematic relationships with a lot of them, but I think she explores that really well and really interestingly, and also how she's not sort of it begins with this story about how she's sort of lying about an experience she had when going to Jamaica with her family to visit some of her extended family there, and then going back to Canada and lying to people in Canada about her experiences in Jamaica, and sort of almost like playing up to some of the stereotypes that they think of people from the Caribbean. So I thought that was a sort of like clever way of presenting this, but also the dilemmas of her identity, and how she wants to fully embrace her heritage and live with that, and the way she explores that in a number of different stories is really fascinating and compelling. But then also the way she shows relationships, particularly between her grandmother and grandfather, who had a very difficult, very thunderous relationship with each other. But yeah, the way she shows that tension and how that translates down through the generations, both with her mother and herself, I thought was so powerfully done. And so, yeah, really enjoyed this so much. And I hope this author writes more because, yeah, I think she's such a powerful writer. And I read Betty by Tiffany McDaniel. And this is a story which is basically autobiographical in that she's writing the story of her mother's life, basically. It's her second novel, but it does go into that family experience and her family heritage, as she's half Cherokee and half white. And the very particular experience that her mother had growing up in the Appalachian region with this heritage. It was such an interesting way of exploring her own family history. And I, personally have found as I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more interested in exploring my own family heritage. I did a whole video about going to Latvia and exploring my Latvian roots and that strain of my family life. And so, yeah, I really appreciate how she brought to life the previous generations of her family through this novel and their troubles and hardships, but also the great humanity of her family and the traditions in her family and the stories. That there's so much in this book about storytelling and how stories are passed down through the generations, and stories can be a way of sort of steeling themselves against the wider world, how the wider world wants to interpret them. And like her father, the father of the main character in this novel experiences a lot of abuse because he's Cherokee, and he gets a lot of abuse for being a Native American from the local community. And he tells these stories sort of as a way of ascribing dignity to his own heritage and his own life in a way that the wider community doesn't. And I thought that was so beautifully done. The interactions between all of the different siblings who are very different from each other, I found really endearing, especially how there's one sister who has a lot of pretensions, and I just found her quite a funny character to read about, although her story gets quite difficult at some points. So there is a lot of humor as well as heartache to all of the characters. And so I found them, even though a lot of the siblings are different types, like definite, very different types, they are quite well rounded, as you get to see all different sides to their personalities and the way that they grow and change together, because it shows their story over a number of years. And I mean, there were some aspects of the story that I thought where it shows the mother's how the mother was abused and how she's living with that trauma and how that affects her. At first, that felt slightly over the top to me, but then as the story went on, I really understood how that trauma was being translated, how she couldn't express that trauma, and so it was sort of leaking out in all these wild and really horrible ways. I mean, she sort of goes on to mentally abuse some of her children in some of the things that she tells them and the way that she tells them and the way she restricts them. And yeah, but the more it got into her character, the more I really appreciated it and thought it was really powerful what the author was doing. So yeah, I thought this was a wonderful novel. I'd like to go back and read her first novel, because this is the first book I've read by her. So yeah, and also what a beautiful cover it has. I mean, this is just stunning. I can't remember if this is also, I don't think this is also the American cover, but yeah, this British cover is just gorgeous, I think. Then I read Emma Donoghue's novel, The Pull of the Stars, which ended up being one of my favorite books of the year. And I talked about it in my sort of wrap-up video about that and my reasons why I connected with it so strongly. And it is taking place in plague-like situations, well, actually in a plague, in the Great Flu of 1918, in a maternity ward of a Dublin hospital, and follows a nurse's story as she's struggling to hold this hospital together as all the medical staff get increasingly ill. She's left sort of on her own trying to care for all these pregnant women, and she's so resourceful and strong and knowledgeable. So she's really admirable in that way. But you see how she's also neglecting her personal life in order to care for all of these people and to care for her brother who's come back from war and has been traumatized by it and now doesn't speak anymore. And yeah, so you sort of get a sense of the personal toll that this has taken and how they're parts of her identity and her romantic yearnings which haven't been expressed before, and she gets to express them when she meets another woman in over the course of the story, and that was so beautifully and powerfully done. It's such a wonderful romance, as well as being this really fascinating historical account of a particular period, and so yeah, I thought this was just wonderfully done and such a powerful novel. Particularly reading it now. Then I read a couple of books actually, which are quite different from each other, but have sort of parallels in that they both feature characters and situations where people are quite isolated on their own in a house, in a structure. And so I think they have this weird relevancy for, the world right now, since I've been at home for almost, 8 months or almost a year now. And by the time, vaccines get out more, it probably will be a year or even more of pretty much just being at home all of the time, and both of these books have that sort of situation. So there's Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is about a man who lives in this giant mansion or very expensive house which contains all these curious statues, and it seems a sort of like mythical otherworldly place, and then over the course of the novel you find out the truth of behind this space and why he's there and the whole story behind it. So there's this compelling mystery going throughout the entire story, but also it's so fascinating how she gets this psychological dilemma of people and the creative process and what happens to our creativity over time and the competitiveness of it, and yeah, there's all these fascinating subjects explored in this novel while telling this kind of fantastical story of this otherworldly place, and it starts to have more real world relevance as the story goes on, and so I thought it was quite powerful in that way. I mean, I was a huge fan of her novel Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and this is a much slighter book compared to that, and I felt like less sort of ambitious in a way in its like expansiveness. That first novel was so like large and expansive. The story of it felt like she could have just gone on and on and on. Where this is a very self-contained, like purposefully self-contained story, and so it felt like tighter in that way, the writing style, but was equally as powerful. And I just really enjoyed it. I mean, I know it's been on a lot of people's like best books of the year list, and it didn't quite make mine, but I did really enjoy it and thought it was such a wonderful reading experience. And so, particularly over the festive season, just to get into this whole imaginative world was such a delight and a pleasure. So yeah, really, really enjoyed getting to this. And then another book, which has been on a lot of best books of the year lists, and which I only just finished, but I can see why it's been on a lot of best books of the year lists, is Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. And yeah, this is such a tense story and really creepy. It's a dystopian novel basically about the end of the world and things ending, starting with a very normal family just going on holiday with each other to a rented house that's out in the middle of nowhere, and then finding that one day a couple show up on their doorstep, and they're the couple who actually own the house, and they say that there's been a huge power outage on the eastern coast, and so they'd like to stay at their house again because they don't know what's going on, and so the story sort of goes off from there, and yeah, and it is so tense, but it's really interesting since I read Don DeLillo's most recent novel, which is, gosh, what was it called? Is it called The Silence, I think? This explores a lot of those same themes in that it's sort of a dystopian story about the end of the world and a group of people, and sort of questions our dependence on technology, because basically they're cut off from the world because they can't use their phones, they can't access the internet, they can't get the news, so they don't really know what's going on. But I thought this was so much more effective than Don DeLillo's novel because it portrays that whole dilemma and complexity, but does so in a much more like organic and compelling story. Like I really cared about these characters, and I like that he spends a lot of time at the start of the novel really getting into their characters and portraying them as basically just like a normal family. But he gets a lot of their idiosyncrasies. Is am I getting that right? Idiosyncrasies. He gets a lot of those, which makes them very endearing. Even though I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time with this family, but I was able to appreciate them from the outside and reading descriptions of them. But yeah, so you sort of get into their characters, and he presents this whole world, which then becomes increasingly narrow as they don't know what's going on and as things start to unravel. And so it becomes really terrifying in that way. And then you get like snippets of what is actually happening. You get this authorial voice telling you what is actually happening in the larger world and what's going to happen in the future, and it's not good. But yeah, so you get this sort of wider perspective, and that's quite tricky to do because I think it's sort of because you're so much in their perspective that it sort of ran the risk of seeming kind of inauthentic, because then you're like breaking out of this very personal perspective to get the privilege of the authorial voice of what's happening in the wider world. But I think he does balance it well, and it does work, and it definitely increased the tension of it, because even though you know what's going to happen because he's like telling you, you feel increasingly terrified for these people in this situation and thinking what you would do in this situation if you were stuck here, because I mean this is basically all of us and what's happening to us. And we all know that the pandemic of the last year could have been much worse if it was much more serious strain. I mean, it has been devastating and awful, and so many people have lost their lives and family members due to this. But it could have been a much more virulent, strain of a virus, which could have been much more deadly and devastating to the entire population. And so, yeah, you can see how easily something like this or a situation like this could be happening. And I know, some people don't want to read about situations like this because of all the stress and tensions of the current real world time period, but I did find it really interesting to get this sort of perspective on the world, and to I think there's something a bit cathartic about reading a story like this during these times. So, and then I just briefly want to mention I did read a story in this wonderful book called London Under Snow by Jordi Llavina, and it's the most wonderful festive Christmas story in it. The story is called My Andalusian Cousin, and yeah, it's the most wonderful new Christmas story I read that really gets to the sort of nostalgia of Christmas, how there's a lot of bittersweet memories attached with the whole festive period, and yeah, it's just a wonderful short story. So I really want to read the other stories in this collection, because I don't think they're all Christmas themed. I think they're just sort of set around winter time. But yeah, I'm hoping to read the rest of these stories. And then also, my partner and I have been reading aloud to each other from the Penguin Book of Christmas Stories, and a lot of classic Christmas tales, and which approaches the whole festive season and the message of Christmas from many different angles. And I really been appreciating and enjoying these. So these have been wonderful to read, as well as a wonderful joint activity to do with my partner over the festive season. So those are all the books I read in December. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you have any thoughts or feelings about them, or if you want to read them now. But also, yeah, let me know what you've been reading over December. I'd be really curious to hear about what's getting you through the winter season, and what you've read over the festive period and over New Year. Let me know in the comments below, and we'll have a chat, and that'll be lovely. So I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.